Marcus Henderson sat alone in the corner booth of the Harbour Grill, his hands wrapped around a glass of water he hadn't touched. The restaurant was one of Seattle's finest, the kind of place where reservations were made weeks in advance, and the servers moved with choreographed precision. He came here twice a month, always on Thursday evenings, always to the same booth by the window overlooking Elliott Bay. It wasn't about the food, though the kitchen was exceptional. It was about routine, about creating small islands of predictability in a life that had been consumed by chaos for the past 2 years. His son Noah sat across from him, 5 years old, with dark hair that fell into his eyes and a face that looked too serious for a child. The boy hadn't spoken since they'd sat down 20 minutes ago. He rarely spoke anymore, not to Marcus, not to the nannies who cycled through their lives with increasing frequency, not to the child psychologist Marcus paid $300 an hour to sit in silence with him. Noah had his tablet in front of him, the screen displaying some educational game that was supposed to help with emotional development. Marcus had downloaded it on the recommendation of the 4th therapist they'd tried. Or was it the 5th? He'd lost count. The waitress approached their table with practiced warmth, a woman perhaps in her early 30s, with kind eyes and brown hair pulled back in a simple ponytail. Her name tag read Sarah. Marcus had seen her here before during his regular visits, though they'd never exchanged more than basic pleasantries about the menu. She worked efficiently, professionally, always seeming to know when tables needed attention and when they preferred to be left alone. She smiled down at Noah as she set a small coloring page and crayons in front of him, something the restaurant offered to young diners. The boy glanced at the paper, but didn't reach for the crayons. His small hands remained motionless on the table, and after a moment, he looked away toward the window where the last light of evening was fading over the water. Sarah's expression shifted almost imperceptibly, and Marcus saw something flicker across her face that he'd seen countless times before. Pity. People always looked at Noah that way once they realized something was different about him, once they noticed the absence where a child's natural curiosity and energy should be. Marcus felt the familiar tightness in his chest, the weight of failure that had become his constant companion since his wife Rebecca had died. The accident had happened on a Tuesday morning. Rebecca had been driving Noah to preschool when a delivery truck ran a red light at an intersection 3 blocks from their home. The driver had been looking at his phone, distracted for just 3 seconds, and in those 3 seconds, Marcus's entire world had shattered. Rebecca died on impact. Noah had survived with minor physical injuries, bruises and a small cut on his forehead that healed within weeks. But something inside him had broken that day, something Marcus didn't know how to fix. He ordered for both of them without consulting Noah, salmon for himself and chicken tenders for the boy, though he suspected Noah wouldn't eat more than a bite or 2. His son barely ate anymore, picking at meals with the same listless disinterest he showed toward everything else. The pediatrician had run tests, checking for physical causes, but found nothing wrong. The problem, everyone agreed, was emotional trauma. Noah had witnessed his mother's death, and at 5 years old he didn't have the tools to process what that meant. Sarah returned with their meals, setting the plates down with gentle efficiency. She noticed Noah's untouched coloring page and crouched down slightly so she was at eye level with him. Her voice was soft when she spoke, asking him if he liked to draw, if he had a favorite color. Noah didn't respond, didn't even look at her. After a moment, she straightened and offered Marcus a small, understanding smile before moving to check on another table. Marcus cut into his salmon mechanically, the food tasteless in his mouth. Across from him, Noah sat, motionless, staring at his plate, but not touching anything. They had become experts at these silent meals, father and son occupying the same space, but existing in separate worlds. Marcus had tried everything he could think of. He'd taken time off from Henderson Financial, the investment firm his father had built and Marcus now ran, to be home more. He'd hired the best child psychologists in Seattle, then expanded his search to specialists in San Francisco and New York. He'd rearranged his entire life, turned down lucrative deals, delegated responsibilities to his partners, anything to be more available to his son. But nothing worked. Noah remained locked inside himself, unreachable despite all of Marcus's wealth and resources. Money, Marcus had discovered, couldn't buy what his son needed most. It couldn't bring Rebecca back. It couldn't erase the trauma Noah carried. It couldn't fill the silence that had settled over their home, like a permanent fog. Halfway through the meal, Noah's face crumpled. It happened without warning, the way it often did. One moment the boy was staring blankly at his untouched chicken tenders, and the next, tears were sliding silently down his cheeks. He didn't make a sound, didn't sob or cry out. The tears just fell, and Noah sat there letting them come, as if he'd learned that crying solved nothing and wasn't worth the effort of noise. Marcus felt his heart crack a little more, the way it did every time this happened. He reached across the table, placing his hand gently on Noah's small arm. He kept his voice low, asking what was wrong, if something had upset him, if he wanted to go home. The questions were pointless, and they both knew it. What was wrong was everything. What was wrong was that Noah was 5 years old and his mother was dead, and his father, despite all his power and money and desperation, couldn't make anything better. Sarah appeared at their table again, and Marcus expected her to discreetly offer tissues or perhaps ask if everything was all right with their meal. Instead, she did something that surprised him. She pulled out the chair next to Noah and sat down without asking permission, her attention focused entirely on the boy. Her voice was gentle when she spoke, telling Noah that she noticed he seemed sad, that it was okay to feel sad sometimes. She didn't ask him what was wrong or try to make the tears stop. She just sat with him, her presence calm and unhurried. Then she began to talk, her voice low enough that Marcus had to strain slightly to hear. She told Noah about her own daughter, a girl named Lily who was 7. She described how Lily loved to build elaborate structures with blocks, how she insisted on wearing mismatched socks because she said matching ones were boring, how she asked 1,000 questions about everything and never seemed to run out of curiosity. Sarah's voice was warm when she spoke about her daughter, filled with the kind of love that needed no announcement. Noah's tears were still falling, but Marcus noticed something shift in the boy's posture. He was listening. For the first time in months, Noah was actually paying attention to another person, his eyes fixed on Sarah's face as she continued talking. She told him about a morning when Lily had been sad because her favorite stuffed animal, a worn rabbit she'd had since she was a baby, had gotten lost. She described how Lily had cried and how they'd searched the whole apartment together until they found the rabbit wedged behind the washing machine. The story was simple, ordinary, exactly the kind of small moment that filled the lives of parents and children everywhere. When Sarah finished talking, she reached into her apron pocket and pulled out a small paper napkin. She folded it carefully, her fingers moving with practiced ease, transforming the napkin into a simple origami bird. She placed it on the table in front of Noah, telling him that sometimes little things could help when we felt sad, that we could hold onto small pieces of beauty even when everything else felt broken. Noah's small hand reached out slowly, his fingers closing around the paper bird. He looked at it for a long moment, then lifted his eyes to Sarah's face. He didn't smile, didn't speak, but something in his expression had softened, as if a door that had been locked tight had opened just a crack. Sarah stood up, returning to her professional demeanor as she asked if they needed anything else. Marcus could only shake his head, unable to find words. She moved away to tend to other tables, leaving Marcus alone with his son and a profound sense of confusion. What had just happened? This stranger, this waitress who knew nothing about their lives, had accomplished in 5 minutes what months of expensive therapy hadn't managed. She'd reached Noah somehow, connected with him in a way that Marcus couldn't. For the rest of the meal, Noah held the paper bird, turning it over in his small hands with careful attention. He didn't eat much, but he stopped crying. When it was time to leave, Marcus left a generous tip, far more than the meal had cost, though he knew it was inadequate compensation for what Sarah had done. As they walked to the car, Noah clutched the paper bird tightly, and Marcus found himself thinking about the woman who had sat with his son and shared stories about her daughter as if it were the most natural thing in the world. The following Thursday, Marcus returned to the Harbour Grill with Noah, telling himself it was just their regular routine. Nothing more. But he knew he was lying to himself. He wanted to see if what had happened the previous week would happen again, if Sarah's presence might somehow reach his son in the way nothing else had. Noah carried the paper bird with him everywhere now, keeping it on his nightstand at night and in his pocket during the day. The nanny had mentioned that he'd shown it to her, the first time in months he'd voluntarily shared anything with anyone. Sarah was working again, and when she saw them, she offered the same warm, professional smile she gave all her regular customers. She took their order without any reference to the previous week, treating them exactly as she would any other diners. But when she brought their food, she included another small origami creation, this time a fish, and set it beside Noah's plate without comment. The boy's eyes lit up with something that might have been excitement, and he immediately picked it up to examine it closely. Marcus found himself watching Sarah throughout the evening, noticing details he'd overlooked before. She was excellent at her job, efficient and attentive, but there was something else too. She had a way of connecting with people, of making customers feel seen without being intrusive. He noticed how she remembered details about regulars, asking an elderly couple about their granddaughter's graduation, congratulating a businessman on what appeared to be good news. She moved through the restaurant with quiet competence, someone who took pride in her work, even though it was clear this wasn't a career she'd chosen out of passion. Over the following weeks, Thursday dinners became the highlight of Noah's week. The boy, who showed little interest in anything else, would ask about it days in advance, wanting to know if they were going to see Sarah. Each week she would create a new origami figure for him, a turtle, a boat, a flower, and each week Noah would add it to the growing collection he kept in a special box in his room. She never sat with them again, the way she had that first night, maintaining appropriate professional boundaries. But she would pause briefly at their table to exchange a few words with Noah about his collection, or to ask if he'd tried making any origami himself. Marcus began to notice other things about Sarah during these visits. He saw the tiredness in her eyes some evenings, the way she would roll her shoulders between tables as if they ached. He overheard her once, politely declining a manager's request to take an extra shift, explaining that she needed to be home with her daughter. Another time, he noticed her looking at her phone during a brief break, her expression tight with worry, before she composed herself and returned to work. It was Marcus's business partner who inadvertently provided more information. Gregory had mentioned during a meeting that he'd eaten at the Harbour Grill recently and had been impressed by their server, a single mother who he'd learned was working 2 jobs to make ends meet while raising her daughter alone. The description matched Sarah, and Marcus found himself thinking about her circumstances more than was probably appropriate. Here was someone working herself to exhaustion for her child, giving everything she had to provide a good life, while he had every resource imaginable and still couldn't reach his son. One evening, Marcus arrived at the restaurant early, before Noah, who was being brought by the nanny. Sarah was setting up her section, and he found himself approaching her, asking if they could speak privately for a moment. She looked surprised, but agreed, stepping aside to a quiet corner near the bar. Marcus had rehearsed what he wanted to say, but now, faced with her direct gaze, the words felt awkward and presumptuous. He told her he'd noticed how much Noah had changed since meeting her, how the origami figures had become precious to him, how the boy actually looked forward to their Thursday dinners now instead of sitting through them in blank silence. He said he knew it wasn't part of her job description to pay special attention to a troubled child, and he wanted to offer compensation for the time and care she'd shown. He mentioned a figure, several $1,000s, presented as a bonus for exceptional service. Sarah's expression shifted, and Marcus immediately knew he'd made a mistake. Her voice was calm but firm when she spoke, telling him she appreciated the thought, but couldn't accept money for being kind to a child. She explained that she made the origami figures during her breaks, that it took only a few minutes and brought her joy to see Noah's reaction. She said if he wanted to show appreciation, he could continue tipping fairly for the service, but what she did for Noah wasn't a transaction to be compensated. Marcus felt embarrassment heat his face, realizing how his offer must have sounded, as if he believed everything could be solved with money, as if genuine human connection had a price tag. He apologized, saying he hadn't meant to offend her, that he was simply trying to acknowledge how much her kindness had meant to his son. Sarah's expression softened slightly, and she told him she understood, that she could see he was doing his best as a father, that raising a child alone was hard in ways people who hadn't experienced it couldn't fully understand. The comment surprised him, and he found himself asking what she meant. Sarah hesitated, then explained that she'd noticed he always came alone with Noah, that there was no mother in the picture, and she'd assumed he was a single father. Marcus felt the familiar tightness in his chest as he confirmed that his wife had died 2 years ago, that Noah had been in the car when it happened, that the boy hadn't been the same since. He didn't usually share these details with strangers, but something about Sarah's quiet understanding made the words come easier. She listened without interrupting, without offering platitudes or empty reassurances. When he finished, she simply told him she was sorry for his loss, sorry for what Noah had been through. Then she shared something of her own story. She explained that she'd been raising her daughter alone since Lily was 2, that Lily's father had left and never looked back, that she'd been working 2 jobs for the past 5 years to keep them afloat. She spoke matter-of-factly, without self-pity, describing it simply as the reality she'd been dealt. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of other customers, and Sarah had to return to work. But something had shifted between them, a recognition of shared understanding despite their vastly different circumstances. They were both parents doing their best in impossible situations, both carrying burdens they couldn't fully share with anyone else. In the weeks that followed, their Thursday dinners continued, but now Marcus and Sarah would exchange brief conversations when the restaurant wasn't too busy. She told him about Lily's school projects and her daughter's obsession with marine biology. He shared small victories with Noah. Like the afternoon the boy had actually laughed at something the nanny said, the first time Marcus had heard that sound in months. These conversations were always brief, professional boundaries carefully maintained, but they formed a thread of connection that Marcus found himself valuing more than he wanted to admit. One evening, Noah surprised everyone by bringing his own origami creation to show Sarah, a lopsided crane he'd made by following a video tutorial. His voice was quiet, barely audible, when he asked if she liked it. It was the first time he'd spoken to her directly. The first time in months he'd initiated conversation with anyone outside his immediate family. Sarah's face lit up with genuine delight, and she told him it was beautiful, that she could see he'd worked very hard on it. She asked if she could keep it, and Noah nodded shyly, offering it to her with both hands. Marcus watched this exchange with a complicated mixture of emotions. He was grateful beyond words that Sarah had somehow reached his son when no one else could. But there was also a painful awareness that Noah responded to her in ways he didn't respond to his own father. That this woman who spent a few minutes with them once a week had achieved what Marcus couldn't manage despite being with Noah every day. Sarah must have sensed something of what he was feeling, because later, when Noah was occupied with his coloring page, she stopped by their table and spoke quietly to Marcus. She told him that children sometimes found it easier to open up to people who weren't their parents, that it didn't mean Noah didn't love or need him. She said that she could see how much Marcus cared, how hard he was trying, and that eventually Noah would recognize that too. Sometimes, she added, healing happened in small steps, through unexpected people, and there was no shame in accepting help from wherever it came. Her words stayed with Marcus long after they'd left the restaurant that night. He realized he'd been so focused on finding the right expert, the right therapy, the right solution that he could purchase and implement, that he'd missed something fundamental. Noah didn't need more specialists or programs. He needed human connection, moments of simple warmth and understanding, the kind that couldn't be scheduled or bought. That realization led to changes. Marcus began to relax some of the rigid structure he'd built around their lives, focusing less on therapeutic goals and more on just being present with his son. He started reading to Noah again at bedtime, something he'd stopped doing because the boy never seemed to pay attention. He took him to parks and aquariums, not as prescribed activities, but just to spend time together without pressure or expectations. And slowly, gradually, Noah began to emerge from his shell. The transformation wasn't dramatic or sudden. There was no miraculous moment when everything became okay. But there were small signs of progress. Noah started sleeping better, having fewer nightmares. He began eating more regularly. He showed interest in things again, asking questions about the world around him. And one afternoon, about 4 months after that first evening at the Harbour Grill, he climbed into Marcus's lap and said he missed Mommy, the first time he'd spoken about Rebecca since her death. Marcus held his son while they both cried, the grief finally finding expression after being locked away for so long. It was painful and difficult and absolutely necessary. And when they were done, Noah looked up at his father with clearer eyes and asked if they could make origami together. They spent the rest of the afternoon folding paper into clumsy shapes, and Marcus felt more connected to his son than he had in 2 years. He continued taking Noah to the Harbour Grill on Thursday evenings, though now it felt less like a lifeline and more like a pleasant tradition. Sarah always greeted them warmly, and she seemed genuinely happy to see the changes in Noah, the way he chatted with her about his origami projects and told her about things happening at school. Marcus made sure to tip generously, though he never again offered separate payment for her kindness. One evening, several months later, Sarah mentioned that she'd been offered a position at a company with better pay and benefits, something that would allow her to quit her second job and spend more time with Lily. She seemed excited, but also a little sad about leaving the restaurant where she'd worked for years. Marcus congratulated her sincerely, knowing it would mean no more Thursday evening encounters, but genuinely glad for her good fortune. On their last Thursday dinner, before Sarah's departure, she brought Noah a special origami creation, a dragon that must have taken considerable time and skill to make. She also brought something for Marcus, a small folded note that she handed to him with a quiet smile. He waited until they got home to read it. The message was simple, thanking him for being a good father even when it felt impossible, for loving his son enough to accept help from an unexpected source, and for reminding her that kindness mattered even in brief encounters between strangers. Marcus kept that note, folding it carefully and placing it in his desk drawer, where he kept other precious things, photographs of Rebecca and Noah, his son's first origami crane, reminders of what mattered most. He thought about how Sarah had changed their lives without meaning to, simply by seeing a sad child and choosing to offer a moment of warmth. She hadn't fixed everything. Trauma and grief didn't work that way, but she'd opened a door that had seemed permanently closed. Years later, when Noah was older and doing well, thriving in school and building friendships and slowly becoming the person he was meant to be, Marcus would sometimes tell the story of the waitress who made origami birds and showed them both that healing could come from the most unexpected places. He'd learned that wealth and power had their limits, that sometimes what people needed most couldn't be bought or controlled, only received with gratitude when it was offered freely. And on difficult days, when the weight of single parenthood felt overwhelming, Marcus would remember Sarah's words about taking help wherever it came from, about small steps and unexpected kindness. He'd think about a woman working 2 jobs who still found time to fold paper birds for a grieving child, and he'd be reminded that the most valuable things in life had nothing to do with money or status, and everything to do with seeing another person's pain and choosing simply to care.